Welcome to The Impact Effect, hosted by conscious leadership expert Tom Eddington, advisor to some of the world's most successful companies and CEOs, where each week we help executives, entrepreneurs, and organizers become more effective leaders while growing businesses that are making an impact in the world. And now, here's Tom.
Hi, welcome to the Impact Effect Network, where we discuss making business matter through conscious leadership. My name is Tom Eddington, and I'm delighted to have Peter Bregman on the show today. Welcome, Peter.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, I've been looking forward to this conversation for quite some time. I've read your books, I've read a lot of your articles, I've watched your podcast, and I'm really anxious to get into this conversation and about the work you do. And I just welcome you to share a bit about your background, how it is that you came to do the work that you're doing.
I came from an unusual route. I came from the outdoor world. I used to lead expeditions, mountaineering and kayaking and climbing, and teaching leadership in the outdoors. I worked for National Outdoor Leadership School in Outward Bound, and that was sort of right out of college. And then from there, I went into the consulting world, and then eventually started my own company and did a lot of writing.
So what were some of the lessons you learned from Knowles and your experience over the years?
I mean, that's a huge question, and I've been told by other people to only take up about 5% of the interview with my answers. So I'm going to try to keep it short. But you know, one of the things that you learn, first of all, one of the things that I learned is the simplicity of it. Like in the end, when you're outdoors and you're living with a bunch of people for 30 days. And you're moving from point A to point B with everything on your back, like everything is reduced to its simplicity. It's about how you relate to other people. It's about how you move literally from point A to point B. And then you work in organizations and there's layers of complexity, but you know, in the end, you could reduce all of those layers to, you know, what's our strategy for moving from point A to point B? Is everybody online? Are we talking to each other? And that kind of, you know, it's the same thing in organizations in a more complex way.
Well, thank you for boiling it down to the simplicity. I'm a huge fan of simplicity and keeping things simple. But as we all know, there's an elegance to having simplicity. There's an elegance and an intentionality to design for simplicity. And love to hear your take on that.
You know, the best CEOs that I know and clients who I work with are really effective at distinguishing signal from noise. And they will identify the three most important things that we need to focus on. And in fact, we designed an entire coaching process based on that idea, based on this idea of like, what is the most important thing to achieve over the next 12 months? And then aligning everybody behind that and working together to achieve that. And it's like, you know, how do we get rid of the noise in order to focus on the thing that's most important?
And what do you observe in the CEOs who are effective at being able to distinguish the signal from the noise? What is it about them? Their background, their skills, the way they show up?
You know, first of all, they have a clear focus, a focus that they have identified and they're brave enough, they're courageous enough, they're emotionally courageous enough to make trade-offs and say, you know, I spoke to one CEO who said, look, we really care a lot about priorities. That's why we have 15 priorities. And I said, you know, that defies the definition of priority. Like, you know, 15 priorities is no priorities. Show me. So they're courageous enough to define, you know, a very particular priority. And then from there, the other thing is they don't need to be the smartest person in the room. They don't need to know everything about what you're doing. They don't need to like win an argument. They don't need to be right. They're just focused and they trust you to do your work. And they ask really smart questions and they keep everybody focused.
And what about for Peter? How is it that you have been able to develop that skill set of being able to distinguish the signal from the noise?
Well, first of all, you assume that I do have that skill set, which is a generous assumption. But I, and by the way, everything I write about, everything I coach, everything I teach, I have spent time struggling with myself. Otherwise, it's not interesting for me to explore and to get to know better. So I'm not a guru on this, and I focus on it because I know it's really, really important, and I do have to kind of work on it like everybody else. But it's if you look at my career and you look at the way I've shifted, I've been running my business for 22 years, and the way it's changed over time, it's always changed based on, okay, I don't need to commit to this for the rest of my life. I need to commit to it for the next 3 to 5 years. What direction am I moving on this? I might be wrong. I have to make it easy to be wrong. I have to be able to rectify. I just made a pivot in my business right now. And I said, I'm going to make a bunch of big changes. I'm going to go whole hog on this for 6 months. I'm not going to ask whether it's working or not. And then in 6 months, I'm going to turn around and I'm going to say, is this working? How might I need to shift it, et cetera.
And when you're making those commitments, and I've been an observer of your work for several years now, and I've seen you make some commitments on things around emotional intelligence, around some areas that folks are starting to talk about or have been in the last couple of years, and you seem to be out on the forefront of that. Where has that come from?
That almost always comes from my personal experience. Like I'm working with a lot of really awesome, CEOs with both rank and power and influence, and they're at the cutting edge because they have to be at the cutting edge of what they're doing. And frankly, and this isn't a pitch for myself, but if they're working with me, they're at the cutting edge. And the reason I say that isn't because, oh, aren't I great, but because they're wanting to push themselves. They're wanting to be at a cutting edge. They're choosing to say, I'm not inexpensive, and they're choosing to say, I'm going to work with this guy and commit to it financially, commit to it in terms of time and resource, which means they're going to be at the cutting edge. And so when they're there, I'm watching for what they're struggling with. I'm looking to learn as much as I can, and it's always different. People are struggling in lots of different ways, and the things that they're struggling with are different now than they were 10 years ago. And so I'm watching that, and I'm learning for myself, and I'm looking at what I struggle with, and then those are the things that I begin to explore more deeply.
Got it. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I've noticed throughout my years of coaching executives that my best teachers in my life have been my children, and then from there, in some cases I'm in a position of leading my clients, and in other cases I'm there to support them, and I'm learning from them.
100%. I'll tell you something interesting that related to that, which is I've got 3 kids. One's in college, and then I have a 15-year-old and a 13-year-old. And we're all living in the same house now. And I mean, we always live in the same house, but I'm living in a house with my brother and his family and my mother. There's everyone's off in different rooms doing different things. But I said something to Eleanor, to my wife, and I said, I'm trying to remember exactly what it was. It wasn't the smartest thing to say. But it was sort of like, oh, did that bother you? Because I noticed you did blah, blah, whatever it was that I said. I can't even remember what I said, but it wasn't articulated very emotionally intelligently. And it wasn't terrible, but it just wasn't right. And then my 15-year-old daughter, who was in the other room, who was in a Zoom class, stuck her head out and goes, Dad, you could have done better at that. I would have done this, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, oh, you're right. You're 100% right. But it took me a second to be like, wait, what? Like, I see what you're pointing out. And I left feeling like, wow, she's smart. But she was right. My 15-year-old daughter was, I spend my life doing this, and, she was right.
Well, my kids are slightly older. My youngest just turned 26, and my oldest child is 28, and it doesn't change. They still continue to teach me on a weekly basis,
which is awesome. Which is like the older they get, the more fun it is, because you realize how smart they can be what they see that you don't. And also, by the way, just being 15, like the world she lives in is more cutting edge than the world I live in, no matter what I'm doing. Like if whether you have kids or not, you should know 15-year-olds. You should know 25-year-olds. You should know 35-year-olds. I don't know how old you are if you're listening to this, but you should know. I think you should be close with someone from every decade, because what they're experiencing informs you of what's going on. I'm informed by what my kids live and breathe, as opposed to what they're learning, because they're living in a world that's different than the world I'm living in.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. It's consistent. My mentor passed away a couple of years ago, age 90, and one of the many things I learned from him was that he was still actively working 4 days a week at 89 years old, and he had people in his life who were his contemporaries. He had people in his life. His children were in their 50s and 60s. He had his grandchildren, his great-grandchildren, and his work colleagues ranged from people in their late 20s to people his age. And I just always had tremendous respect and admiration for the way he lived his life, because it kept him young, it kept him vibrant, and very connected to the world.
It's beautiful. It's a beautiful story. And so my mother's 90. My father died in April, and my mother's now living in this house that we're all living in. And we were having a conversation, and she was saying, like, she's going to go to Florida. She has a place in Florida. And I was like, why not just stay here? And it's the weather's getting a little cold for her. She doesn't really like the weather, but she was also saying, it's not natural. I shouldn't be living, with my children. And I said, look, it's only not natural in the past 70 years, because for human history, we lived in multi-generational places. There is no gift bigger that you can give us than living with my children and having the interaction and going for walks with them. And like that's an irreplaceable experience. So to really bridge, I feel incredibly fortunate that we're living in a space right now where we have 3 generations. And I think my kids are and I think they realize how fortunate they are for it. So that's exciting.
Well, I suspect you're learning a lot from that, as you are from your clients right now, and what they're going through with the world being shut down and opening up again, and still dealing with the uncertainty of things. And I'd love to hear a bit about, and have you share with the audience what it is your clients are informing you, what they're letting you know they're needing right now, and what services or what way you can best support them.
It's an interesting question. There are ways in which things have not changed. So the world has changed. George Floyd, the diversity inclusivity has taken on a much more important and centralized role in every organization that I'm working with. The pandemic, obviously, and everybody is spread around the world, and certainly, it doesn't matter whether they're spread around the world or spread around the neighborhood. The dynamic is the same, which is that you're talking with people over Zoom a lot. In fact, a lot of my conversations with clients, which were on Zoom one-on-one, I've now switched to phone, because I think you really, really need Zoom when you have multiple people in a room, but people are so exhausted with Zoom that it's actually a relief to them to go, hey, let's go have a phone call. Go take a walk. Let's walk together, like you in your neighborhood, me in my neighborhood. And so that's been useful. But I would say that the things that haven't changed is kind of what I was saying beforehand. You need to have, and this becomes ever more important, you need to have a clear strategy, what I would call the big arrow, right? You need to make sure you're very, very clear on what it is you're trying to achieve over the next 12 months. You need to make sure that you have a very strong leadership team. You have to make sure that they are emotionally connected and engaged with their people, all the more so. That was important when we were all in the same space. But the truth is, most of my clients, there's always been a hybrid situation where there's been a lot of people in one space, and you're on the phone with Europe, and you're on the phone with Asia, and you're, we've always been spread apart. So how do you develop that emotional connection as a leader in a way that is supportive of the direction that you're moving in? And how do you align everybody so that collectively they're moving in the same direction, especially as they're scaling? There are some businesses that have really suffered, call it restaurants. There's some businesses, and many of my clients, where this has been a real boon in a way that they have to be careful about how they talk about. But, you know, in technology companies that have been leveraged, I mean, I have a client whose stock price went over the last year from $100 to $300. Like there's opportunities, but when you scale to that size, especially when everybody's remote, you really have to be skilled as a leader of getting everyone on the same page and moving all the little arrows in the same direction so that you scale in a way that keeps your focus. And I'd say I'm spending a lot of time. And then I guess the last thing I'd say is I'm spending a lot of time with clients personally, helping them. You know, I always say about my coaching that I'm focused on helping people be exceptional leaders and stellar human beings. And I'm finding in a way that gladdens my heart that I'm finding people are more and more interested in that stellar human being piece, that they really care about who they are as people, not just who they are, you know, in the front line as leaders or the kinds of outcomes or results that they get, but they really care about who they are as people. And I love that, and that hasn't changed. It's even gotten stronger.
Yeah, I'm happy to hear that. I mean, I acknowledge that the CEOs and the leaders that seek me out, there's certainly self-selection that goes on. But in all of the work I've done as a coach, the clients who have sought me out have been interested in having conversations about being a stellar human being. And the leadership stuff is important and it matters, but it's secondary to who they are as a leader and as a human being. And I'm really encouraged to hear, I'm not surprised knowing your work, that that's your experience as well.
Well, you know, there's this great research that came out that I read earlier, and I think I might have this research on my podcast. I haven't figured out what my next season is going to be, but it's this great research that basically says being, and this is it's subtle, being a jerk, you know, being an unpleasant person doesn't help you get ahead. It doesn't hurt you, right? Like when they looked at all of these people and their success in their careers, turns out it doesn't hurt you, but it doesn't help you, which I love, because there is this myth in some sectors that you've got to be ruthless, or you've got to be uncaring, or you've got to, and in order to succeed. And the answer is you could be. We all know people who are very, very successful in their lives who are not people we want to hang out with. Like, we all know those people. And we also know people who are. And so what I love about this research is that the outcome of this research for me is that it's a choice. Like, you can succeed as a jerk, or you can succeed as a caring person. And you don't have to be one or the other to succeed. So make a choice. You want to be nice, you want to be a jerk, and make that choice. And by the way, I'm the guy you work with if you want to be nice. I'm definitely not the guy you work with if you want to be a jerk. But there are people who you can work with. You're in the same boat as I am, right? And there are people that you can work with who don't care if you're nice or jerk. They're just going to help you get results. You'll get results either way. The question is, who do you want to be when you get those results? And there's something about that choice that I absolutely love.
You're watching the Impact Effect Network. Who you are is how you lead. Conscious leadership is an intuitive, intentional process requiring an open heart, an open mind, and a committed desire to fully own how you show up in the world. If you're a CEO, a solopreneur, or a community leader, Tom Eddington's ebook helps you amplify your strengths, making you the best version of yourself. Download the ebook today and become a part of bringing conscious leadership to the planet.
I appreciate you sharing that, and I'd be curious to know, for the researcher, what metrics they're using for success. I suspect it's limited to just financial or position, title, etc. It's not.
I think that's what. Yeah, I think that's what they're looking at, not necessarily whether they're divorced or not, or whether they have whether they have lots of friends but the truth is, like, we all know jerks who I know people who I don't want to hang out with, who, like, deep down they may be very troubled, but you wouldn't necessarily know it from, they have friends and they have families and they kind of, they have career success. I do think that they were focused on career success more than anything.
Yep.
But I don't think all jerks are isolated. So it really is like one of those things where, wow, like you could really, it's just, you got to choose, you got to decide what you want. I mean, I love the fact that it's a choice. I love the fact that it's not, because, I've had clients, I've walked away from clients where they've gotten feedback and they're not at all interested in changing the feedback.
Yeah.
And they have lots of turnover and they don't really care. And I'm thinking, I can't prove to you. I believe it, but I can't prove to you that your revenue will go up, your operating expenses will go down. Like, I can't prove to you that that's what will happen if you address some of this feedback and work more effectively with other people. I can't prove it. Believe it, but I can't prove it. But if you don't want to do that, that's fine. I'm just not that guy. And, and I've walked away from clients because, and by the way, they don't not want to do it because they think their way is right. They don't want to do it because they don't have the courage.
Right. Meaning
they're the victim. They blame it on other people. One person said, my biggest problem is I hire all the wrong people. Those are the ones who give feedback. Like people will construct whatever narrative they need to construct in order to be okay with themselves. But, at that point, I'm not the best person to help them, because they kind of don't want to be helped. They sort of want to stay in that space.
Yeah. If there's not an openness or a willingness to continue to learn and grow, it's a waste of time and resources for everybody involved.
Exactly.
Well, I wanted to pick up on a point you made earlier. You mentioned George Floyd, and I go back 20 years ago when I was consulting with some of my clients on what was happening in the marketplace. They were seeing a tremendous as the U.S. population has become increasingly more and more diverse over the decades, a client base that was becoming more and more diverse. And I was having conversations with them about the need to have a more diverse workforce. And many of them, they just weren't seeing, they weren't hearing it. And over the last 20 years, we've seen a rise in awareness around bias, both conscious and unconscious. And now there's a social justice piece to diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace that seems to be pushing things in a way that market opportunities weren't driving companies to tap into 20 years ago. And I'd love to explore that with you a little bit and get your take on it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's 100% right. I think the world is opening to it in a new way. I think we've been driven to it by dysfunction and, frankly, by like a resurgence of white supremacy in I don't want to get all political here, but you see it in a way that when 20 years ago we didn't see it. We certainly didn't see it as boldly as it was happening. And so there's an awakening. There is an awakening of it. And I also, I wrote an article for HBR a few years back about how diversity training doesn't work. Because it doesn't, because there's, the typical diversity training. And I was just talking to a company that was asking me, they're saying we have a stated goal to move people to basically a manufacturing company, 80% factory workers. We have a stated goal of moving people along a spectrum of anti-racism. And I said, that's great. Like, I believe that for myself. But you're now imposing that on a 1,500 person population. You're going to get a lot of pushback because they don't necessarily want to move along a spectrum of anti-racism. Like, that's your agenda, it's not their agenda. And so you have, so they kind of went ahead with it. and they got a lot of pushback and blowback on message boards and things like that. And they were really surprised by it. And it was kind of virulent. And so now that brought them 5 steps back, because now, but on the other hand, it's maybe also 5 steps forward, because it makes evident something that was like much more subtle. And so then the question is, what do we need? How do we help people move beyond that? And then you realize, okay, well, we have to teach them some skills that they can use regardless of what the ultimate objective or master plan is, like empathy, like engaging in difficult conversations, like, listening in a way where the other people really feel heard, like leaders identifying a common purpose that everybody could work toward, no matter what their, political viewpoint and disposition. And we need to just bring in lots more people who look different in organizations. And like, those are the kinds of things that move people along the spectrum. But you don't have to, that's because it naturally happens. Because when I have coworkers who look different than me, and I've learned to listen and to empathize and to connect and to be in different conversations, then I naturally change my position. But if my goal is propaganda to change your position, you're going to resist, because I would too.
You're watching the Impact Effect Network, the world's first 24-hour on-demand business and leadership video and podcast network, bringing conscious leadership to a global audience.
Yeah, I appreciate that approach, and it reminds me of some of the conversations I have with my clients, especially early on in an engagement, where we explore what is their personal narrative. And the 2 of the fundamental questions I ask are, do you believe, and why do you believe it? Mm-hmm. To really help them examine, where do their beliefs come from? Where do their stories come from? Why do they tell themselves the things that they do? Because without that sense of self-awareness, we can't, and the curiosity associated with it, we can't go on the journey that's needed.
I'm curious. I'm just so curious about that, because I think that's great. I think it's beautiful. And I'm wondering whether people often have answers to that, or they don't necessarily know what they believe or why they believe it.
It's a multi-layered conversation, because there's the initial reaction to it, and then there's a need to go away and think about it and explore it, right, and then come back for another conversation, and then go away again with additional soak time and reflection.
It's great.
So just picking up on where we were before, I'd love to hear a bit more about what's your sense of the world has changed so much and is continuing to change at a rapid pace. Where do you see things evolving over the next, I'll limit it to 2 to 3 years, in terms of what organizations need, what your clients are going to need, and where society's going?
It's a great question. And I don't know everybody. I would have, if had we had this conversation 6 months ago, I would have said, take all your money out of the market, and I would have been wrong. So I think, predictive ability, I just saw this prediction from Goldman Sachs that said, the market is going to rise another 10% or fall over the next 4 months. And I'm like, well, that's a great prediction. I can make a prediction too. It's so I think it's hard. I'll say that what's on the minds of my clients and leaders of a lot of these companies is, how do we plan for the next 3 years? We don't know what the next 3 years is going to be like. We know we have to plan for remote. We know eventually there's going to be a vaccine. We know, is it going to be before November 3rd? I kind of hope not, because I think if it is, I have enough experience, and I've written about, what happens when people are pushed towards an unrealistic goal, right? And what happens is VW and the diesel scandal, or what happens is there's all these examples, Sears, when they were pushing people to get certain kinds of results, and people just started lying, and Firestone with tires, all these examples of people who are pushed to meet unrealistic goals often meet them at a cost. Boeing, right? And the safety.
Right.
They often meet them with these side effects that Pinto and, blowing up when it's rear-ended. Like, there's just a lot of evidence that say when we push things towards a goal that we want that is unrealistic, and this is clearly unrealistic in terms of, the amount of time it actually takes to make sure that a vaccine is safe. I keep saying I'm not political, and I don't think these are political issues. Like, I'm not standing on a side of one or the other. I'm just saying, and look, I'm not going to be the first one to get a vaccine anyway. I'm 52. I'm not an essential worker. I'm not. But what I've advised my 90-year-old mother is, when that vaccine comes, don't take it yet, because you really want a million other people to take it and then see what happens. But I don't want to do that kind of a human trial on my mother before it's ready. So I think a lot of people are saying, we don't know what the next few years are going to be. We have to plan for a situation where this is a new reality. And we also have to plan for a situation where lots of things change. And it's just very hard to identify. So now put that together, which basically says we have to plan for optionality, with what I said earlier on, which says we have to be really focused, distinguish signal from noise, and drive. And now you've got a challenge, which is that it's hard to stay focused and have optionality. And then I'd say a third thing is for companies that have grown a lot and have been very, very successful, then and for whom this period of time has helped them succeed. I mean, I think there's 4 companies with over a 1,000 PE ratio, right? Zoom and Amazon, and there's 2 others. I can't remember what they were. I just saw this the other day. So it's like, how do you not remember Microsoft from 2000 to 2015? Their revenue grew every single year, and their stock price was completely flat for those 15 years. And it's because, that growth was already baked into a price that was way too high. So it never crashed. It just didn't go anywhere. And so I think leaders are really thinking, like, if I've got momentum, and this has been, an opportunity for us, even though, we have to acknowledge how terrible it's been for so many people. But for this company, it's been an opportunity. How do I maintain that kind of growth and trajectory, so we're not flat for the next 15 years? And what are the decisions I make, and how do I continue to grow? For other people, it might be like, how are we pivoting? For small, I don't work with restaurants and things like that, but my heart goes out to them, because, like, I don't know what you do. You're not going to raise prices, then no one's going to go. You're not going to, like, how do you manage this? You just have to, like, be rich enough to weather it. And that's what you have to be in the travel industry. You have to be rich enough to weather it. And so I think it's like, I think managing the growth trajectory and understanding the need for optionality, and at the same time balancing that with a need for focus. And, I'm busy. I'm busy because these are very, very hard times for leaders, and at the same time, there's this whole other side, which is that, leaders have to project the kind of humanity that they might have very personally, which is much harder for someone who's an introvert. So, it's like, how do you signal, like, even if you're a good person and you care about diversity, you care about inclusion, then you also have to somehow talk about it, and you somehow have to, and they're like dangerous waters to tread, because we have so many blind spots we don't know. Like, especially I'm talking about myself as a white man, like, there's so much I don't know. And so it feels risky to talk, because I'm going to say something that's going to cross a line, and they're going to be right. I will have crossed a line, whoever tells me I've crossed a line, and I won't even see it. And that's very scary. And those are the kinds of risks that we need to take as leaders in order to continue to learn and continue to grow.
Well, picking up on that, I've watched over certainly over the course of my career, but especially in the last 10 or 15 years, this openness to leaders being more human, openness for leaders to show their humanity. And it's obviously it's a very welcome change. It's a needed change. Many of the leaders I work with, I don't want to say they struggle, but they try and find what I call the appropriate vulnerability. How much of my humanity can I really bring to work? It's always situational. It always depends on the individuals that they're working with and the relationship they have. But this willingness to be more human is welcome, but there's not a recipe book. There's not a roadmap. And many of the conversations I have with leaders are trying to figure out how to get it, quote unquote, right.
Yeah, I think that's really true. And I think here's what I think. I think if you are open, if you are curious, if you have humility along with your confidence, then you can take good risks to be really human. And if you make mistakes, you won't get defensive about them. You'll acknowledge them. You'll notice it. You'll learn. You'll pivot. My view is like the best thing that we can do is be ourselves as leaders. And in order for that to work, we need certain traits as leaders, right? We need curiosity. We need humility. We need confidence. We need openness. We need these things. Because if we don't have those things, then it's a little dangerous to be ourselves. But if we do have those things, then it's pretty safe. It's pretty safe because, when we fail, we acknowledge it and we learn and we get up. And that's very, very human, and everybody recognizes that.
Well, I'd like to pick up on the conversation we were having a moment ago, and I'll use two examples. In the early 1960s, President Kennedy set this vision of having a man walk on the moon. And then we fast forward about 15 or 20 years, and we had the Space Challenger explode. And in both of those cases, there was an aspiration, there was a culture, there was a leadership, there was a clear vision, but the execution on those two visions had a very different outcome. And when I look at the uncertainty that we have in the world today, for leaders, it's just as likely they could have either of those outcomes.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's funny because when you mentioned that, and I actually think Tesla is one of the. Actually, it's not Amazon. I was wrong. Amazon is not 1,000 PE ratio, but Tesla is. And they're doing space travel. They're doing private space travel. And I do think it's true. I do think that very sadly, and I remember that Challenger moment very, very well. And it's like, I can't watch a space launch without imagining in my head that it's going to explode again from having seen that happen. It's just like ingrained. It's like not anything that any of us who saw it on television will forget. There are some industries where the tolerance for failure has to be zero. So Alan Mulally, who was the CEO of Ford, and he was the CEO of Boeing before that. And he's an engineer. I don't know if you know him. I know him, and he's a terrific guy. And he's he's an engineer. He's a very process-oriented leader. And the way he leads and the way he his process for leading is very, it's like invented by an engineer. But one of the things that I've really appreciated about him behaviorally is he has zero toleration for deviation from the process. So he basically says, okay, so, one of my rules is you don't make jokes at someone else's expense, right? That's one of his rules. And so if someone's in a meeting and they make a joke at someone else's expense, he'll stop the meeting. And he won't just like laugh it off or move on. He'll stop the meeting. And he'll say, look, there's nothing wrong inherently with that kind of a joke. It's just not right for this place. So if you want to be here, right? If you want to be here, then you can't say that. But there's nothing wrong with it. So if you really want to say that kind of stuff, there's nothing wrong with it. You just can't do it here. right? Like basically your job depends on you not saying that joke again. And it's like zero tolerance. And so many of us would say, hey, we have a rule. And that rule is, we're not going to say jokes at someone else's expense. And then it happens and you're like, well, it wasn't that big a deal. And it wasn't so much at someone's expense. And that's the courage of leadership, to have like a real process. And so, those are the people I want leading my plane companies and my spaceship companies and so he went from Boeing to Ford, and he was asked, by one of the reporters, like, Mr. Mullally, you don't know anything about cars. Like, you've never worked in a car company beforehand, and why should we believe that you'll be successful as a CEO? And he said, car is a pretty complicated thing, right? There's 30,000 different parts in a car, 30,000 different parts. They've all have to fit, in the right way and the right things, and it has to continue to drive. But I've been CEO of a plane company, and a plane has, and I don't know what the actual number is, but it's got to be like 150,000 parts. It's got to be 5 times as much. I don't know exactly what, but let's just say 100,000 for the sake of argument. A plane's got 100,000 parts. And that plane has to stay in the air. So I've never run a car company before, but I get the idea. and it's great. And it's like he does, right? And you have to have that. And unfortunately for Boeing and for passengers on that plane, like Boeing has failed to maintain that kind of focus of zero toleration for deviation from process under new leadership. And I fault the leadership for it. I mean, I don't know the leadership, but I know Boeing under Alan. And I can tell you that I fault the leadership for that, because they pushed for things and they were willing to overlook certain things in order to get to certain objectives. And as a result of that, planes crashed.
You're watching the Impact Effect Network. Is your team tuned out? Are you looking for a powerful speaker to motivate and inspire your organization? Then Tom Eddington is the choice for keynote speaker at your next conference or event. Tom is one of the most sought-after business advisors and coaches in Silicon Valley. For over 2 decades, Tom has advised world-renowned CEOs and executives on how to catapult their organization's success, including Hewlett-Packard, NBNA Corporation, and Royal Dutch Shell. In his dynamic keynotes, Tom offers fresh new paradigms on how to create healthier, happier, and more purposeful workplaces while navigating change and generating higher degrees of success for organizations. For information on booking Tom at your next event, contact eddingtonadvisory.com.
The work I do and the clients that I work with are focused on what I call conscious leadership. And for me, it's leaders who are very intentional about understanding the context, understanding how they're showing up, how they're making the decisions that they make. And, there were clearly choices made in the change in leadership at Boeing or in many organizations, a change in the culture. And for me and the work I do and what I talk about on the show is being very intentional about those changes and being very self-aware. And those are 2 critical characteristics of being a conscious leader. And I'd love to get your definition of conscious leadership and maybe explore that topic a bit.
Yeah, so it's funny because I was just in a conversation with John Mackey, who wrote the book Conscious Leadership and who's the CEO of Whole Foods. And he tells the story of how he almost lost his job and how, how that awakened him somewhat to say, oh, I've got some things I need to learn here. And, one of the questions that I asked him is, look, John, you've been incredibly successful. You started a health food company in the 70s, along with 1,000 other hippies who started health food companies in the 70s, and yet you're Whole Foods, right? So like, it's different. And I think this willingness, and we discussed it a little bit, but I think this willingness to grow, this willingness to change, this willingness to look at what's there and look at truth and reality and say, and look at yourself and be self-aware and say, what do I need to do? I know a tremendous number of people who are very successful at the first stage of leadership and can't scale their leadership. A friend, Marshall Goldsmith, wrote this great book called What Got You Here Won't Get You There, right? Like what's going to bring you to a certain scale of leadership isn't going to bring you to the next. And leadership is all about scaling in many ways, right? It's all about growing. If you're leading, you're trying to grow something. That's what leadership is. You're trying to grow something for the most part. You might be trying to grow a movement. You might be trying to grow a company. You might be trying to grow a family, but you're growing something. And if you're trying to grow something without changing, you're screwed. and so if you're asking other people to change, you better be willing to change. So I think conscious leadership is all about a willingness to continually look and question yourself, what you know, what you think you know, what you're willing to learn, what's happening around you, and to continue to be open to your own change and to your own growth and to your own learning, and to be what Carol Dweck would call a growth mindset versus a fixed mindset. And you need confidence to be able to do that. In my book, Leading with Emotional Courage, I talk about these 4 elements: confidence in yourself, connection to others, commitment to purpose, and emotional courage. And I've written a bunch of books, but my favorite books are the ones where once it's published, the more I talk about it or the more I work with clients on it, the more I discover things about the book that I didn't know when I wrote it. and that's happened to me with only, I've written or contributed to 18 books, but it's only happened with 2 books. And where I've really and 2 books that, I've written 4 books myself, and it's 2 of those 4 books. And one of them was 18 minutes about managing time, and the other one was Leading with Emotional Courage. And I recently, I think the quick shot is the confidence and self piece. I think is really important, because confidence is not arrogance. We confuse it with arrogance. Arrogance is I know more than you, right? Confidence is I don't know. There's a lot I don't know, right? If I'm confident, I cannot know things. If I'm arrogant, I'm way too insecure to not know things. So confidence, true confidence, is a willingness to question and understand. And then I'll just because it came to my mind, even though it's not answering your question, I'll sort of share this piece, which is, so I spent the summer down south with a lot of people who have very different political viewpoints than me. And so there's these 4 elements, right? Confidence in self, connection to others, commitment to purpose, and emotional courage. I thought the divisiveness in our country was a connection to others problem. And so I was in conversations with people and I was listening, and I'm very good at that. I really am. I can empathize. I can make you feel heard. And part of that is actually listening, actually learning things I didn't know. But I found myself quite unsuccessful at the point at which I was like, okay, I think I've understood this, and you've said that you think I've understood it, and can I share with you my perspective, to get them to not argue with me, as opposed to, I found myself quite unsuccessful at that. But then I realized our country doesn't have, for a number of reasons, a connection to others problem. In fact, there's so many reasons why, starting with the fact that we're all operating off of a different set of facts driven by the way we consume media. But there's so many reasons why we're divided. What we actually have, and it's what we started this conversation with, is a commitment to purpose problem. Is that, and you would have thought that coronavirus could have been that purpose that aligns everybody together. But it's what I talk about every CEO with, which is your clarity about where you are focusing people on moving forward. And right now, people are focused on the divisiveness. We need to find something bigger than all of us that we can agree on to start working. This summer, I built a house with my father-in-law, a little house, an 8 by 10 foot house with a little 4-foot porch. And, we designed it on the back of an envelope. And then with all the kids, we built it. And my father-in-law and I have different politics, but we get along very, very well. And we worked very well together. And I think we grew to appreciate each other even more deeply in our work together towards this common purpose. And so I think right now, aligning behind a common purpose is essential for this country, and it's absolutely essential for each leader. So conscious leadership is in part the self-awareness, being confident in yourself enough to be able to question yourself and not know things, and then to be able to focus on something bigger than ourselves in order to achieve something that we can align people behind.
Well, I hear what you're saying, and I absolutely agree with what you're sharing. And for many of the leaders that I work with, they're able to do that in their organization. They are working to do that in the communities in which they operate.
That's great.
The challenge they have is that their remit doesn't go beyond the bounds of the company. And yet for the last decade or so, business has been driving the agenda of the world. And we're starting to see some indications that CEOs are accepting that responsibility. And we're starting to see some conversations with leaders about what does that mean? What is our commitment to society?
Yeah, I love that. And I think so the one question I ask both of us, and maybe we begin to do this together, right? Is, if we're working with a bunch of individual leaders who all have a remit that's organizational, collectively, they have power and a remit that could be societal. And so it's like, if people can't let go of their day jobs, right? They have to deliver for their organizations. But they also, most conscious leaders see that the kind of society we're operating in is essential for every element of the success of our business.
Correct.
And so given that, collectively, there's a tremendous amount of power with a group of CEOs, more so than there is with an individual CEO whose remit is their organization.
Yeah, and I think that the challenge, at least what I've witnessed, when we saw the proclamation last year that by the Business Roundtable that the purpose of business was going to shift from focusing on the shareholder to all stakeholders and a broader societal commitment. I've talked to some of those CEOs who were in those conversations, and candidly, they acknowledged that it was window dressing because of concerns about some of the things that were happening in the House in Washington, and that it was, I don't want to poo-poo it as just window dressing, but there wasn't a real serious commitment to actually shift to a stakeholder as opposed to a shareholder way of running their businesses.
Yeah, I think it really takes probably, starts with, what's that Alice's Restaurant song, it's like it starts with 2 and then it goes to 3 and 4 and then 8 and it's like you start in one place and then you try to branch the circle out so that it is taken seriously. Because I agree with you. I think at the end of the day, shareholders are not yet, although that's changing, right? With ESR investing and it's changing that, but shareholders are not yet holding companies accountable for more than their own financial returns. And I see that somewhat changing. And, it's the kind of change that starts bottom up as well as top down.
Yeah, and it's tricky. I look at the work that the Drucker Institute's been doing over the last, whatever it's been now, I guess probably about 8 years, looking at companies that are expanding their metrics beyond just the bottom line. And there's actual financial data and evidence that companies that operate beyond just the bottom line do outperform their peers. So that the data is there, but I'm not seeing enough movement yet. Yes, it certainly helps that BlackRock and others have said we're looking at ESGs. We are looking to impose some other metrics, but we haven't seen an adoption rate I would have expected with the actual data that exists.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. I don't know the answer to that. Sadly, I don't know the answer to that. It's worth exploring more.
Yeah, you go back to the 1990s and look at someone like Ray Anderson and what he did with the manufacturing of the carpet industry, or at least their business. and the ripple effect it did have to some extent on the competitors. You could look at John Mackey. I mean, there are examples out there of individuals, but to see a collective change, there still seems to be some headwinds.
Could be interesting to get a group of people together who like Patagonia and Whole Foods, which is now owned by Amazon. So
Right.
there might be some complication to that, but people like, let's say you got the top 10 people who, it's not just business roundtable, it's people who have already demonstrated that they are paying attention to and focused on a wider stakeholder model, and see where you go from there. That could be a very interesting project.
Yeah, well, I think there's a willingness and openness to that, and we're certainly seeing more and more organizations that are starting to be receptive to those conversations, or at least willing to engage in them.
Yeah. I think it's great. You've gotten me thinking about this, because I think if you took if you took like really the top 5 or 10 leaders who are running companies that are aspirational for lots of others, who have had tremendous success, who have been focused on a stakeholder model, who care about more than the bottom line, and that has actually enhanced the bottom line. Now you've created a small club that lots more people want to be a part of. And, the human motivation to be part of a club that lots of people want to be a part of can drive all sorts of change. And, that personal desire is at least as strong as shareholder pressure. So, that's like, it's sort of an interesting thing to think about.
Well, it's likely, for us to see that change, it's likely going to have to come from those organizations as opposed to from Washington.
Right. Oh, for sure. For sure. I think Washington, unfortunately, rarely leads.
Yeah. Yep.
Right.
Well, Peter, it's been a delight having you on the show today. I really appreciate the conversation. And I would just ask, as we're closing, what's the 1 or 2 things you'd like the listeners and viewers to take away from our conversation?
First of all, this was a super fun conversation. So thank you for having me. And, I think this last piece is, what I'm taking away from this conversation is the idea that it really might be worth trying to pull together some of these people and see what we can produce with it. But, what I would like listeners to take away is, this thing, which is like, we really do have choice. Like, we really do have choice as to how we show up in the world. And, sadly, my father died in April. And that's really impacted me in a way where I really, everybody says you can't take it with you, and it's so trite, but it hits home when you lose someone who you see doesn't take anything with them. And my father's a lovely, sweet, kind man. It wasn't about that at all. But it reminds me that it's not about that. It reminds me that, like whatever short time we have on earth, we can make an impact, and we can have fun, and we can connect with people, and we could do a little bit of good, and it really, like, that often takes the back seat to what you rightly said is, I wonder how they define success, probably by career progression and the amount of money that they made. And so I think if we balance that out with a sense of like, questioning the race that we're running and focusing on the impact that we want to have, that could be very, very powerful, especially, as you get on in years and you begin to look back on your life.
Well, thank you, Peter. And just a final question. What's the best way for folks to get in touch with you if they'd like to connect?
Our website is bregmanpartners.com, BREGMANPARTNERS.com. And you could find out everything. You can reach me through there.
Terrific. Well, thanks for being on the show. I've really enjoyed the conversation today.
It's been a pleasure. I've really enjoyed the conversation too. Thanks for having me.
You're watching the Impact Effect Network. Thank you for joining Tom Eddington on the Impact Effect. Visit impacteffectnetwork.com to connect with Tom and discover additional episodes featuring today's top leaders making a global impact through conscious leadership in the world today.